We were there in 2006 to see the Three Gorges Dam, which was amazing.
Oh yeah, that's next to my hometown.
Very, very impressive.
Yes, I got two friends in Wales. Walford, Ina and Barry, they say apologize.
Yes.
They have something to do this afternoon, couldn't join in.
Yes.
In the future, we can organize again. All right. So.
Good morning from America, and good afternoon of our friends in Europe, and good evening to our friends in China. It's our great honor to invite Dr. Walford Gillison to join us today. He is our special guest today. He's going to talk about an English schoolboy in war-torn China. It's the presentation is going to be based on the book he wrote, but to us, it's actually a forest planted by our medical missionaries, part 2, because he presented last time, if we can recall, about his life in Union Hospital. Dr. Guilford, if we can recall, he is a grandson of Dr. Thomas Guilford, who was the founder of the full-time physician surgeon to Wuhan Union Hospital, probably is one of the first pioneers to serve that area. And his father is our last president of Union Hospital before 1949. He grew up in China, including 4 years as a prisoner of war under Japanese occupation until 1945. So after that, he went back to UK and became a fellow of both Edinburgh and the London College of Surgeons, and then get postgraduate training in Bristol, Sheffield, Chicago in the United States, and Nottingham, UK, and became a consultant surgeon before he retired. So it's our great privilege to have Dr. Gillison here. I'm going to pass my podium to Dr. Gillison.
Greetings to everyone, and I apologize, Debuchi, about those who have to get up so early this morning. I hope you will not be too disappointed. To start the story, I was born in Wuhan, in the Union Hospital, Sheho Yuren Union Hospital, in 1935, in the building which to you looks very old, but was very new. It had only been built about 7 days before, but it was a very good building, because you may remember in 1931, there were terrible floods when the banks of the river Yangtze in Hankou broke, and there was flooding for many months before recovery. But the new hospital survived and was able to start work very, very quickly. My parents were, my father was G. Gison, Keith Gillison, and my mother was Kathleen, and they were quite busy for the first 11 years of their life in Wuhan. My daughter Meili was born in 1929. My sister Frances, Meili was called Meili, that's the Chinese for Mary, and she was called Meili all her life. Frances was also Lillian, so she was called Li Lian, and I was, Walford was born in 35, my name was Hua Fu. My parents took compulsory leave back in the UK at a very difficult time, because the Japanese war had started unofficially in 1932, but officially in 1937, and the cities along the Yangtze River and the Yellow River had very bad bomb damage. My parents were mortified to be away at that time. The Battle of Wuhan took place in October 1938 while we were still in the UK, and because the Kuomintang forces had no active military aircraft, the battle was lost in that October, and Japanese occupation of Wuhan took place. My parents were away because every several years they had to report to all the churches and supporters in the UK and in Canada about the work in China. During that time they were in the UK, Britain declared war against Germany, and therefore a very tough decision was made to leave my sisters behind, age 6 and age 9, to be in Britain during the war at boarding school. My father, mother, and I went back to China on a ship called the SS Narkunda. It had to zigzag along the Atlantic Ocean because of German submarines who were wanting to destroy all shipping in those early days. But my father believed that God wanted him to work in Wuhan, so he was convinced his ship would survive, and it did survive. So when we got back on Christmas Day, 1939, in Shanghai, I remember being horrified to find Japanese soldiers on my ship and not Chinese soldiers. This is how I learned how severe the war had become. And as you can see, you had Mao Zedong fighting a guerrilla war in the northwest, Chiang in the south and west against Hirohito and his forces from Japan. In our situation, we were in a strange place. British and French and Swedish and other nationalities were not at war with Japan in those early days. And all the hospitals were very badly flooded with casualties, especially in central China, from this vicious war taking place. I remember the Japanese were very suspicious of all foreigners. They could not understand why we were there and why we were supporting the Chinese people. They had not read their history books properly. But during this tough time, while this war was taking place, quite a few exciting things took place in Union Hospital, including the surgical department. In your bottom left picture, you will see 3 young girls who were left outside their houses in midwinter, and they had severe frostbite, and they had to have an emergency amputation of all limbs. Thanks to the International Hospital Technology Department, which was based in Wuhan, in the Union Hospital, new artificial limbs were found, and you could see these girls able to walk and go home. The strange equipment you see in the top left-hand corner, we called an aeroplane splint, but it was because there were lots of complicated fractures of the upper arms from the Chinese soldiers who had been defending Wuhan. In the old days, before we knew about antisepsis, I remember the great Joseph Lister said, if you have a compound fracture, there is more than 50% chance of having to perform an amputation in a compound fracture. Fortunately, some research was done at World War I, which the doctors at the Union Hospital were aware of. And so these soldiers were placed in splints. They didn't need a hospital bed, and they were treated with a rubber catheter, antiseptic solution, irrigating the fractured ends. And sure enough, here they are. It's a bad photograph, but there are 11 soldiers, Chinese soldiers, who are being treated with their compound fractures. I'm pleased to say they all healed, and none of those arms had to have amputation. And this, I think, was a great achievement by the IHC, the technical department, and also the surgical department. And this event was published in the British Medical Journal in 1940, long before antibiotics. And this, from purely irrigating infected wounds, has saved those men's lives and their arms as well. This, I think, was a great achievement while the war was going on between China and Japan. So in this interim period, when we were neutral against the Japanese, my father was able to return to full-time work with trainees. He had to go once a week to Wuchang to do a clinic. There was no road across the river that day, only the railway. So you had to go on a ferry to go to Wuchang in those days. That must make you all feel very young. We had a wonderful cook, and the lady who looked after me was called Nai, called an ama. I loved her very dearly. She gave me much more time than my mother, and I loved Nai very much indeed. They had a little boy called Yotse, and he played with me when we got back from school. They were very good friends. Dasafu, that's the father, was a wonderful cook. And I can say, having traveled around the world and been to many Chinese restaurants, that the Wuhan Chinese food is the best Chinese food in the world. My daughter is the head of a cookery school, and she says exactly the same. Anyway, we went to school like other children did in a little lorry. While I was there in 1941, we saw a total eclipse of the sun. We had a candle under a piece of glass, which made the glass black, and then we could look at the sun and see the eclipse. Very exciting. I learned to ride a bicycle, and then I had an ethical lesson from my father. He said I needed to have my tonsils out. I said I did not need my tonsils out, but because he was older than me and a qualified doctor, I had to go to the Union Hospital for tonsillectomy. When I got out of hospital, he told me his assistant, a very good Chinese surgeon, did the operation. I was very angry with my father. I said, "Why did you take out the tonsils?" And he said, "When you are a surgeon, you must never operate on your family unless it is an emergency." And your operation was done perfectly. So I learned a lesson at a tender age not to get involved with treating your own family, except it was an emergency. I had a new friend called Stray Dog who turned up in our house, and he seemed to be comfortable, and he became a very good friend until I had to leave Wuhan. Then, of course, the tragedy you all know. Pearl Harbor took place on December the 7th, 1941. Hundreds of ships were sunk, thousands of lives were lost, and on the same day, Hong Kong was bombed and war was declared against Britain. We had to have permits to leave the premises of the Union Hospital. We had to wear armbands so they know which type of enemy we were to Japan. We were very proud to wear our armbands, but the Japanese thought we should be ashamed. Eventually, the Japanese decided that in Wuhan, we were too near the front line of the war between China and Japan. So we were taken in an escort vessel of the Japanese Imperial Navy to Shanghai, because Shanghai was fully under Japanese control and no more fighting taking place. So we went down there in 1942. We stayed in a very smart clubhouse, or which had been for the wealthy American and Chinese residents of Shanghai. They had all left, and you can see by the clothes hanging on the wash line, it was being taken over by 300 prisoners of war, including my family. Eventually, the Japanese decided that all the foreign prisoners of war should be spread in various camps. You probably know all the names. The camp that my father and mother and I went to was at Yangzhou, which of course, as you know, is situated on that wonderful structure, the Grand Canal. The Grand Canal is about 5,000 kilometers long. It would probably took 5 centuries, and many lives were lost to build this amazing structure, which of course is one of the great sights of the world today. So we were taken by ship to Zhenjiang, and then from Zhenjiang, the last 20 miles, we went on little barges up the Grand Canal from Zhenjiang to Yangzhou. When we arrived at Yangzhou, we were in a prisoner of war camp, which used to be a school for 200 American and Chinese boys, boarding school. So 640 prisoners of war were squeezed into a rather small place. Note the wall, which is just very near the Grand Canal itself. At the bottom left-hand corner used to be the headmaster's house, was now where our superintendent was situated. The hospital of the future hospital was the headmaster's house, and there was administrator's house, but most of us, about 600, were billeted in dormitories of various quarters of the school, showing the dining hall and the reservoir to provide us with water down there. One very good thing was we had latrines, because there were no toilets, and through there was a hole in the wall where the excreta were passed, and it was used for farming, local farming. A very good example of recycling of protein material. So this was our home for 2.5 years. Our routine was very straightforward. A young boy who could play the bugle gave a call at 6:30 in the morning. We had breakfast. In summer, it would be a congee, which is like a rice pudding, and in winter, it would be cracked wheat. At 9 o'clock, we all 640 of us had to stand in lines, and we had to number in Japanese because they did not speak English. Our favorite number where we liked to stand was 5, because the 5 in Japanese is go. So we would always shout go very loudly when we reached our turn. Need you go we didn't like, which is the Japanese for 25, but could you go, 95, was nearly as good as go. At lunchtime, we had what they call tiffin in the old-fashioned days, and it would usually be a stew with pork or buffalo meat if you were lucky, or of course always plenty of soya. The evening meal was the same as the morning meal, the lunchtime meal. Roll call was done for a short while, but because all our electricity was cut, they stopped the evening roll call, because if people wanted to escape, they would leave after 9 o'clock. We were told if we tried to escape, we would be shot and the remaining prisoner of wars would be punished. But when we stood in roll call, we had to stand still. If you moved, then you had your face slapped. When you are in a prisoner of war camp, there are really 8 important problems to tackle. The accommodation was very tight because we were 640 people in spaces for 200. I shared a room for 2.5 years with 21 other people. Some people snored, some people spoke in their sleep, and some people didn't sleep. It was quite exciting for a boy of early age. Food was the most important thing. Everybody was aware of the need for food and then water. We got to know some of the Japanese people. The fight for morale was important. I'm glad to say all religions were tolerated, and the next biggest battle after food was education. With food, it was the most fundamental problem and the need for everyone day and night. It was very bad in the last 6 months because Tokyo refused to pay anything towards our food. They said they had no money left to feed prisoners of war. One of my friends was known and reported, which is quoted in another book, he prayed to God. He was so hungry, he prayed to God he would not wake up in the morning. That shows how desperate it all was. Food came in various shapes and forms. According to the 1929 Geneva Convention, Japan did not sign up to the convention, but it did outwardly say it would adhere to it, that to provide enough food for prisoners of war as they did for their fighting soldiers. In fact, they said they would not do that. Occasionally, we had parcels from the Red Cross. The International Red Cross decided when the war started that all nationalities at war should get some form of luxuries, lard, milk powder, something once a month. In our case, being 180 miles from Shanghai and the headquarters of the Red Cross, we didn't get our parcels very frequently. The British, American, French, Belgian, Dutch governments all agreed to send some money to a little bank account, it was called comfort money, but it was rather like pocket money. In the beginning of the war, in our beginning of internment in 1943, you could buy a basket of food with your ration of comfort money for once a month. By the end of the war, you could only buy 1 egg with that money because of inflation. The Shanghai Taipans, there were a few of them who were wealthy. Sometimes their staff would smuggle some food over the wall for them, but that was not very often. At the end, we had an emergency, which I will tell you about, but we could provide ourselves with some protein by the milking fathers, as we called them. They were basically soya bean between a grindstone, and the white soya milk was a good source of protein for everyone. Halfway through imprisonment, the commandant allowed us to have some goats, and 6 goats for 600 people didn't go far, but we children had 1 cup of goat's milk, which would last for 10 days. It was like grown-ups, for us, it was like grown-ups drinking champagne. Water. Again, you have to find a lot of water for 640 people when normally it's things. And it came in 3 directions. We had some engineers who repaired a pump, and they pumped from the Grand Canal through a hole in the wall, and it came to our reservoir tank. But if there was not enough, then laborers from the Grand Canal would come with water barrows. I will show you in a minute. And that would have to be paid for by the Japanese until the last 6 months. And then it was poured into our storage camp. And in the rainy season in Yangzhou was about April, and we would collect all the water from the drain pipes, from the rooftops, to go to the camp, because water was so precious. But wells were the other and most important source of water. This is how water was brought up from the Grand Canal, and you can see the battlements on the which our camp was on the other side. Our storage tank was placed just in front of the houses with the red roofs, and they would be about 10 meters by 5 meters by 3 meters deep. And we put alum on the surface to sterilize the water and let it settle before it was taken to a water house. Here is a picture of the laborers, very powerful, strong men. They had straps across their backs, and they would carry these water barrows. They were very heavy into our camp when we were short. Here is an POW's drawing of the water house, where every drop of water was boiled for consumption. We had to impress everybody must have it boiled before that. We had 3 thermos flasks per day when we started, but unfortunately it was down to 1 person per day. So therefore, when it was 1 flask of water, you use that for drinking, and we did not wash or wash our clothes or things at night. The morale is absolutely essential. Without a camp morale, people will commit suicide or just fade away without any effort. And we're very lucky. We had a good camp representative who spoke Japanese very fluently. He's called George Grant. He was a great man. We tried to find everybody who was an adult something to do. There's an expression which I'm sure you all know: the devil finds work for evil hands to do. Campfires was the name we had for our concerts. Once a month, we had an electric cable to a light bulb under a red cloth, and we pretended it was a campfire. Some of the songs and concerts, people played a honky-tonk piano. One woman could play a tune with a saw, an ordinary hand saw, and a violin bow, and she was brilliant. Sport was the one thing which kept us going. We taught the American boys how to play cricket. The American boys taught us how to play softball. Boxing was very popular because the Japanese said the winner could have a extra loaf of bread if he won the fight. So we had a lot of people were putting on boxing matches. My mother did not like violence, but when I won a loaf of bread, I gave half to my opponent. She somehow had to sacrifice her principles by accepting the extra loaf of bread. Poor woman. The bush telegraph was an expression we learned from reading between the lines in the papers. The Shanghai Times would repeatedly report battles across the Pacific in which the Japanese Navy and forces totally destroyed the American forces coming across to Japan. But we noticed that every time the Americans were being totally destroyed, they were always on groups of islands nearer and nearer to Japan. The British Navy was called the Rubber Navy because it was always being reported in the Mediterranean Sea or the Atlantic Ocean or the China Sea of being totally sunk. But the thing is, the British fleet came back again in another ocean only to be totally sunk. So we were convinced that the Royal Navy was full of rubber ships which kept floating. The most important part of our morale was kept up by the women who came in who were paid to empty all the latrine buckets from all the toilets. They were very brave women. They were told not to talk to us, but as time went on, they would find somebody who's understood Chinese and tell us how well the war was going for China, Britain, and America. And this, of course, made life much better. And we learned to respect all religions while we were there. And this was very good for morale. Gossip was very good. Sometimes they were fairy tales, sometimes they were true. I've mentioned the Shanghai Times. The B-29 huge flying fortresses were eventually flying high in the sky, and no Japanese Zero fighters were to be seen. So we knew the war was going well. We also noticed that our captors were getting more solemn and sadder and less friendly. But our brave Mordong armors did the most for us, after all. Our local wildlife was good, and this is a lovely bird which came every spring. It told us that the frost and the ice was going to melt, and this is called the golden oriole, a lovely bird which it was one of the best things we could ever see. So what were our Japanese captors like? Were they as horrible as we were painted, or were they like anybody else? By this time, when we were prisoners of war, after capturing Manchuria in 1921-22, by this stage, the British Army had been driven out of Burma and Siam and the Dutch East Indies. It really looked a very serious situation. But fortunately, that did not continue anymore. The Japanese were different then than they are today. They really believed that they belonged to a master race, and that we, the British, the Chinese, and the Americans were inferior. They told us that they would die for the emperor if required. Why did we not die for King George? Why did not the Americans die for President Roosevelt? Therefore, we were lesser race than the Japanese. As I said before, they paid lip service, but did not keep to the 1929 Geneva Convention. They also informed us that they would win the war and expect full reparations, and even we would have to pay for the cost of our being their prisoners of war. So this was the aggressive, arrogant attitude in those days. We had numerous levels of Japanese. The commandant was Hashizumi, who was not too bad a man. He had been a prisoner of war himself under the Americans, and he was exchanged for an Allied prisoner of war in 1942. A nasty man was Colonel Nashida, who was the senior military officer. He never smiled. He would wave his big long sword around to show what a tough guy he was, but he was somebody we kept away from. The nastiest, awfulest man was a non-commissioned officer called Tanaka. He was a crook because he would take funds from our comfort money account, which came in small quantities each month. he got hold of one of our prisoners of war who was doing some work on some water pumping, and said he had not asked permission, flogged him and left him kneeling in the snow in front of the commandant's house to ask for mercy, and he was in the snow for 2.5 hours. Our excellent representative, George Grant, came over to the commandant and said, unless you release this man, I will resign as your representative, and somebody who can't speak Japanese will take my place. The man was released and admitted to our little hospital, and he made a good recovery despite having heart disease. We had a young sergeant called Yamamoto, who was a bit of a show-off, but when one of our boys died from diphtheria, he was sobbing in the back of the service because he had a boy the same age back home in Japan. And he would tell us, towards the end of the war, he told us, when the Axis are winning, you will find me sober, not drunk, on Saturday nights. If the China, Britain, and America are winning the war, I will be drunk on Saturday nights. So we were very pleased when we saw him with a hangover on Sunday morning at roll call. So we knew the war was going well. The lower ranks were mostly Korean guards. They would kick the football back onto the pitch while we were playing, and they were very nice to us. I could not understand why, but my father said, when you have been fighting a war against China since 1931, and you have children, you're bound to be homesick and bound to miss your children. Of course you want to play with any boy or any girl in a situation like that. They had bayonets in their waist like swords and revolvers. They would allow us, if the officers weren't looking, to play with those bayonets. But we were very disappointed they would not let us play with their revolvers. So my reflection at the end was the Japanese were like any other nation. They are good people and they're bad people, and they're very ordinary ones as well. Big problem was here we are with 200 children in a prisoner of war camp. What are you going to do about education? Otherwise, they will lose their place in their schools and in their colleges. So we found that the dining hall would take place for the junior school where I was. There was a little hut, I'll show you, for the senior schools. We needed paper, which was in great shortage. And of course, we needed pencils or pens. And then what would happen to the children when the war was over and they went home? Here is the senior school in part, which was wide open, very, very cold in winter, but quite pleasant in summer. And it's where the school's done in shifts of about 20 in order to get them seated and to do work. Materials. Being the junior school and we're not taking exams, I remember doing my arithmetic with sharp sticks on the ground when we were short of material, but we did have crayons and chalk with slates to do our sums or write our stories. But all pencils, and they usually came from the Red Cross, were reserved for the students who were going to have to take examinations. And all labels from the castles, they were paper, so they were white on the inside, but colored on the outer side. I've tried to make a picture like it. So that is a bundle of papers in which they'd been taken from the Red Cross Castle cans. The inside was white, and that could be used by the students for exams for the paper. And that would be the appearance of the, shall we say, answer number 1 on a senior paper at the examination carried out under strict conditions. And it was a great success. It was difficult, but a great success. We had war emergency school certificates for the 16-year-olds, and they could go to high school or college. And the ones who were 18-year-old, the advanced level, they had their marks and their signatures and their certificates. And that meant that when the war was over, all these bundles of papers were sent to Cambridge University. And the good news was, they said that all those who had passed according to the standard of question and marking could go on to the 6th form or to high school, and all those who had passed the A level or advanced level could go to university. This made every child, every parent of each child, and the school teachers very proud, because they could so easily have lost 2 or 3 years of education. Now we move on to health, where most of you who've been to the Union Hospital are probably all too familiar. We had 3 doctors, we had several nurses who were excellent nurses. The hospital was a converted house. The operating theatre, I'll show you in a minute, was a shack on the back of the house. And the dentist was a wonderful man from Nanjing who had his own machine, except that the electric motor wouldn't work. So he got his drill attached to a cable, and at the end of the cable, he had a large wheel about 1/2 meter in diameter, and he had strong men rotating this wheel, and this large wheel would rotate the end of the drill for him to get rid of caries teeth. And then he put temporary filling in, and it was amazing. He had no amalgam. It lasted for many years. My father had a temporary filling, and it lasted 2 years. Here is the rear view of the hospital. I'm sorry it's not clear, but you can see the little dark hut on the back. That is it was the operating theatre. So they removed 24 tiles from the roof there on both sides and found some glass in order to get light into the operating theatre for working during daylight hours. Only once did my father have to do a night operation, which he did by candlelight at about 10 o'clock at night for a strangulated femoral hernia. And he was very worried that it would go gangrenous if he waited to the morning. Most of our medical problems, I think, were malaria and various dysenteries. I remember having amoebic dysentery at the end of the war, and the treatment was going to be repeated enemas, but fortunately the Americans dropped some emetine in and 6 injections, and I was cured. Prickly heat, we all of you will remember, and we all suffered from. We had to try to avoid the hot sun in the middle of the day. Bed bugs, where we had no special treatment for it, but we would wake up in the morning, lift up the end of the bed, bang it on the ground, and we had bets on who had the most overnight. Yangzhou finger was a disease from the erysipelas, which occurred when the staff in the kitchen were preparing pork and meat. And so the doctors in charge said you must clean your hands much more meticulously, and they were given surgical gloves whenever they were spare to prepare the meat, and that reduced the incidence of Yangzhou finger. Chilblains, of course, you will all remember, and we had cases, mostly respiratory cases of tuberculosis. There was one ankle which had to be fixed in a good position for walking to take place. On the surgical problems, my father did most of the surgery, and carcinoma was treated more or less today, but without the benefit of chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Basal cell carcinomas were very frequent because of the exposure to sun. There was a lovely parotid tumor removed, and my father borrowed a boy's Meccano set and made a retractor so that he could get the tumor out without damaging the branches of the facial nerve. Colon cancer was usually referred to the main hospital in Shanghai because we had no facilities for colostomy bags or for much post-operative care. Everyone had experience of piles and ischiorectal abscesses. I told you about strangulated hernia, and then of course appendicitis occurred. We found we had a political appendicectomy. 2 or 3 of children and young people had acute appendicitis, and my father removed them, and they were all straightforward. They were diagnosed in good time. And then one day, my father was called to the commandant's house to look at a guard with abdominal pain. My father diagnosed acute appendicitis, and he said, "You better get him down to your military hospital as soon as possible." The commandant said, "But Dr. Gillison, you have removed appendices in your operating theater here. Why can't you treat my guard?" And my father said, "I have no problem treating your guard if you are wanting me to do that." The commandant said, "Well, the last guard who had appendicitis, we sent him to Shanghai and he died of post-operative complications. So we'd like you to treat him." So when the guard arrived in our little operating theater, he was followed by 4 guards with masks, gowns, and caps, pointing a revolver at my father. My father said, "Please do not point the gun at me because I do not kill patients on the operating table." They said, "We'll put our guns away if you tell the commandant we're pointing the guns at you." So my father said, "That's fine, and I won't tell the commandant." I'm glad to say the guard made a good recovery, and within 24 hours he was back in the guard's hut. A small percentage of our fellow campers criticized the medical and nursing staff for doing this operation, saying that it's up to the enemy to look after their own people. But I'm glad to say most of the camp said the hospital camp said, "No, that is, you're not treating an enemy, you're treating a human being." And in actual fact, it was the best thing they did. Until that guard's appendix had been removed, they always had problem getting enough antiseptic solution, enough chloroform, enough syringes, enough needles to carry on the work. But once that Japanese guard got back to his barracks, cured of appendicitis, the hospital staff had more trouble getting supplies or instruments. So it was a very good political appendicectomy. Our mortality was thankfully low. We had 8 deaths out of 640 over the 2.5 years, but the young boy had an acute diphtheria which killed him in a few hours. It was so virulent, and it was heartbreaking to the whole camp when that happened. There was a young boy of 18 who was convinced he would die before the war was over. And in actual fact, when we did know the war was over, he was told that, and yet psychologically he just rolled over, turned his face to the wall and died. We didn't have post-mortem facilities, so we had to put it down to a degree of tragic willpower as to why he died. Great shame. In the closing days, it was very confusing. Lots of rumors were circulating. We heard gunfire outside. We later learned it was some of the advancing soldiers were coming along. They knew that our guards were armed. And then we noticed the letters and telegrams, which were rarely coming through. There was a bonfire outside the commandant's house of our letters and our telegrams. And we realized that probably there was information to show that the war was over, which we had not been announced. There were even more food shortages. I mentioned that Tokyo refused to pay for any food in the last 6 months of the war, but our commandant managed to find funds from other directions, and also the Swiss, the neutral Swiss embassy found some money, so we had some food. And then funny things began to happen. On the left, you may see a derelict building on the edge near the edge of the wall of the city, overlooking our parade ground. And to our amazement, in July, this building was repaired with 5 horizontal windows showing. What on earth was this due to? And at the time, we didn't know. But afterwards, we'd heard there was a rumor that every Japanese commandant was going to be told to kill all their prisoners of war and go back to Japan to defend the fatherland. I never found any document, but I did hear the same rumor from another camp, a camp called Longhua in Shanghai. Anyway, that was a mystery until many years later. What did happen, of course, and we had no idea, was the bomb on Hiroshima that took place on August the 6th. And of course, the Japanese did not surrender, so another bomb was dropped on August the 9th on Nagasaki. And then eventually the Japanese did completely surrender. They surrendered on August the 15th on SS Missouri to General MacArthur on that day. And the Japanese forces in the whole of China surrendered to China's residual ambassador for Jiang Jieshi or Chiang Kai-shek on September the 9th. So the war was officially over by that time. Here were we, unlike the camps, the prisoner of war camps in Shanghai and Tianjin and Beijing, where the prisoners of war left in 1 or 2 days. We were 6 weeks before we were able to leave the camp. But we did have Allied personnel coming down to tell us stories of the war in Europe, in China, and the Pacific. We had food dropped on 2 airplane sorties from the side, food that we hadn't seen or tasted for years and years, because people were very desperately. And finally, we had some news from family and friends beyond Yangzhou. This is a cartoon by one of the camp people showing these huge 200-gallon drums of food being dropped by parachute onto the ground. They scattered all over the place, and some of the Chinese citizens were very pleased to have some food dropped outside the compound. One of these drums dropped through the house of number 3, where my mother was talking to a friend. Here is the house, it's house 3, where my mother was with her friend, and the drum went through within half a meter of my mother. It hit the bed where she used to be sitting on. She was fortunately standing by the windows, and she was unscathed. But I nearly lost my mother from being killed by kindness by parachutes. So why did it take so long to get out? And we found there were several things. Years later, Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi was desperate to get to Shanghai because Shanghai was so important from the point of view of commerce and trade and communications. With it behind his back was the equivalent of the CIA. This American general with a man called Dali, who was a very successful guerrilla fighter, was there, and they did a tremendous job. They rescued quite a few parachutist lives and so on, but they were complicating the picture. Here was a man called Du Yusheng, who really was a chief criminal or bandit from one of what they called the Putung pirates, but he was doing an amazing guerrilla warfare, but he was not too worried about who he was shooting at from time to time. And then we had local bandits who were starving, and they were desperate to get food. And also there were some disconnected Japanese troops who were trying to find their way back to Shanghai and to go back to Japan. So there was a lot of military muscle outside our camp walls, and that's why the Japanese guards still had their guns, still had their bayonets, because it was needed to protect them and not us. Anyway, eventually, a British commando officer arrived. He had disarmed the Japanese, and all of us went back to Shanghai and to our respective homes. Why did the World War II end so abruptly? This is the question. I have had the luck to befriend a very eminent historian at Oxford University called Rana Mitter. He said there were three possible reasons. The main one was that it was the third reason. America had lost 170,000 US troops in the Battle of the Pacific, all the way from Midway to the Philippines. And he knew, and we all knew, that the Japanese people on the whole were going to fight to the death for their emperor, so they would lose even more troops had they decided on a land battle, also with the British and Commonwealth people. But much more significantly, China had lost probably 20 million Chinese military and civilian deaths, probably more civilian deaths than military ones. There were thousands and thousands who had fought to resist the Japanese. They were so good at resisting the Japanese were amazed that they hadn't conquered the whole of China. A lesser reason might be that they would drop the bomb to save our lives. I have to accept the fact that this horrible weapon, the atomic bomb, might have saved my life, in which case I wouldn't be here today. But also, I do know from Professor Mitter that the Americans were concerned by the rapidly advancing Soviet troops coming across Manchuria and working their way north. So there were perhaps three reasons why the atom bombs were dropped on it, but I think the further loss of life was probably the strongest reason. So what about me as a little boy? Having been through this until the age of 11, I think I learned the gift of life is so much more precious than ever, and that's what matters. I always joke about how terrible the school food was in post-war Britain. Britain was a very poor country. We owed millions of dollars to America for support, financial support. It took us until 1989 or so before we paid back the national debt to America. The other thing that happened was General MacArthur was the official ruler of Japan for 3 years, and he introduced the whole concept of democracy, of trying to get a majority government by the people's choice and not by the military junta. And I think with education and the spread as all over the world, I found the Japanese people I met when I was in Chicago were very normal people. And the other thing I learned was what a small place the planet Earth has become. So I want to finish with my personal statement. On behalf of my grandfather, Thomas Gillison, my grandmother, who also was one of the early women doctors, my father and myself, we want to thank the hospital staff of the Union Hospital for all the friendships we've made. I am very lucky to have 3 friends in the hospital with whom I communicate. I want to say something a little bit, which has nothing to do with me, is about the war in 1950. As you remember, my father and my mother were back at work at the WWII, and when, of course, the Korean War began. So suddenly, we British were enemies of China and not enemies of Japan. And therefore, all non-communist foreigners had to leave China. This made my father and mother, but particularly my father, very sad. His father, my grandfather, died in China when he was ready to die. And he was very sad to leave China. But I want to say how the political climate, particularly amongst ordinary citizens, has changed. And since 2001, the Union Hospital has invited and sponsored 10 members of my family, including myself, on 5 occasions. So I would say, Sheshe Bugandong. Thank you for your attention.